This video is brought to you by the new opening variant for Alicization. I made a new mini explain on that, so don't forget to check it out please. This week in Sword Art Online Alicization, we had a short but intense battle between Kirito and Eugeo, reached the top of the central cathedral, and also covered double the amount of content as the anime had done in the past 4 episodes, so quite a lot of scenes were either skipped or just shortened entirely. Welcome everyone, it's me Gamerturk, and this is your most accurate source of Sword Art Online information, Alicization Explained, featuring episode 21, the 32nd night. As always, timestamps to individual plot points are in the description, as well as a pinned comment for easy navigation, but to give you a quick rundown, volume 13 was relatively short, so it was possible for the anime to crunch it into 4 episodes without major cuts, but volume 14, Alicization Uniting, is 210 pages, and obviously the 40 page per episode no longer works, and it really shows with how much was cut from this episode. But if you're new to my Explain series, what I do here is essentially provide you all the vital information on characters, events, action, lore from the source material, light novels, things that the anime did not convey properly or just did not have the time to, so you can still see the full picture. But then again, if you want to read the books for yourself for the amazing experience, Amazon and Book Depository affiliate links are in the description, and the knowledge of Stacia awaits you there. And to add, my current giveaway featuring the first 2 volumes of the Sword Art Online Girls of spin-off manga can be found in the description and the pinned comment as well, so do check it out for a chance to win. But without further ado, episode 21 kicked off with the contents of volume 14, Alicization Uniting, and did cover around 80 pages, consisting of the entirety of chapter 12 as well as starting the contents of chapter 13, part 1, and skipping a lot of events as it did so. Sadly, that 4 episode quote-unquote pretty damn accurate streak has come to an end, and we got a lot to cover in this video. But the episode begins exactly where we left off, with both Kirito and Eugeo lunging towards each other with their swords glowing green, the sign of the Aincrad style one-hit lunging sword skill, Sonic Leap. When both clashed their swords, Kirito saw a tiny emotion light up in Eugeo's eyes when he mentioned Alice, but it was quickly hidden away, much like earlier, but this got Kirito thinking. When Eldri's mother, his stolen memory, was mentioned to Eldri, the piety module was completely destabilized and had started pushing outwards. Alice, however, while still recognizing Selka, had not been destabilized by the mention of her sister, so Kirito had deduced that it wasn't the memory of Selka who was stolen from her, and surely it wasn't Eugeo either. So what was actually stolen from Alice? And when it came to Eugeo Synthesis ritual, it was a similar situation. Eugeo had not even budged at the sight of both Kirito and Alice, 2 of the major contributors to his life. If it wasn't him or Alice, then what was taken from Eugeo? Had Quinella even taken anything from him at all? He seemed to remember all the sword styles, and as Alice had mentioned, he was way too proficient at sacred arts and incarnation to actually have an empty mind with nothing in it. But even though Eugeo Synthesis 32 remembered everything he had been taught by Kirito on the Aincrad style, Kirito had not taught him everything. Pulling back and breaking the balance of both swordsmen, Kirito's reckless move had even worried Alice so much that with the side of his vision, Kirito saw Alice reaching for her Osmanthus blade to intervene, but neither Alice nor Eugeo were aware of the Aincrad style martial arts skill, Crescent Moon. But it is outright incredible how detailed this 3-second move is in the novels, and while the anime showcased it as much as it can, the depth was naturally not there, so time for a battle deep dive. Kirito knew he had taught Eugeo some other close quarter skills of Aincrad, so chances are he may have been easily destroyed Kirito in this instance if he suspected the existence of kick attacks ever so slightly, but Kirito was shocked at what came instead. Something even the best PvP players back in Aincrad barely managed to pull off. Eugeo was attempting to use the pommel of his sword to change the trajectory of Kirito's skill and causing his attack to completely whiff and leave Kirito in a post-skill delay. But while the sword skill was not stoppable due to system assist, you could barely affect the movements, which was exactly what Kirito did, slowing his skill by a split second so Eugeo's hit would miss. And that Kirito succeeded at, missing the pommel and barely managing to hit Eugeo's hand instead, kicking the Blue Rose sword over to the ceiling and not suffering a significant delay as he would against the deflection, while it was Eugeo now suffering a knockback effect. Just when Kirito was going to end the duel with the one-hit skill slant, however, it was Eugeo's time to surprise him again, bursting 5 wind elements, the maximum amount one can generate with a single hand, pushing Kirito back to the end of the room. As they went back at each other, Kirito managed to get the upper hand again, but suddenly recognized the reddish glow from Eugeo, who had his back turned to him after the blowback. The two-handed counterattack skill that Kirito knew from Aincrad as Backlash that only worked against an enemy located in your back, a skill Kirito did not really use himself due to his fondness for one-handed skills, and certainly a skill that Kirito did not teach Eugeo. Once his slant met with Eugeo's backlash, it was time to dive deeper into the memories. Responding to Kirito, Eugeo stated the name of the skill, Stormwave Baltio style. It was much less flashier than the Norkia and High Norkia styles that was practiced at the academy for their artistic value, just like the Underworldians liked it, which was why the Baltio style was kinda looked down upon by the residents, much like Sortilina's Starlut style, but Eugeo did not look down upon it. In fact, it was the much more practical style compared to Norkian styles. But Eugeo did not remember Golgoroso Balto, who had guided Eugeo throughout their time at the academy. But Kirito knew there was more to the fights in the virtual world. He had traded enough blows with the likes of Asuna, Sugua, Shinon in various other worlds, as well as the likes of Fanatio, Eldri, Düsselbert and Alice in Underworld. But most of all, it was Konno Yuki, the proof that the blows one dealt in virtual world was more than just data. There was meaning behind every single blow, there were things you can only share by fighting. And with that, Kirito lunged forward one last time. No skills, no tactics, just running with the flow as he unleashed more and more of Eugeo's memories. He felt the shell blocking Eugeo away crack further and further with every single one of his blows, and well, we got a major cut from the anime as a certain scene was only covered from one perspective. The more and more they clashed their swords with the flow, it wasn't just Eugeo cracking down. Kirito also had started to feel something familiar and barely even realized he had a grin on his face. And then Kirito realized. The cracks he was hearing, they were cracks in his own memory as flashes of a distant past appeared in his head, likely the same time they did in Eugeo's. Kirito saw himself sparring with Eugeo, but it wasn't the academy, it was back in Ruliet. However, Kirito did not recall their weapons. They had always trained with wooden training swords, not toys like the ones they were holding right now. Suddenly, Kirito came back to his senses the moment the swords locked one last time, as if they had done this before. Kirito saw Eugeo's mouth move but didn't hear anything at all, yet he was certain Eugeo had just murmured his name. Kirito knew his partner had the same faint memory. And for a moment, Eugeo glossed over his shoulder towards Alice. Kirito shouted with one last breath towards Eugeo, snapping him back to the reality as he watched the faint, sad smile on his face deepen. However, thinking the battle was finally over, Kirito had not foreseen what Alice had, which was cut from the anime among another major change. Suddenly, Eugeo changed his stance and cast his memory release with the command release recollection, unlike the enhanced armament used in the anime, bringing the memory release usage count to 2 on top of the times he used perfect weapon control already, putting much more strain on his Blue Rose sword. Eugeo really wanted to ensure that Kirito and Alice would stay down here, so it was natural he would use his ultimate skill to freeze them as solidly as possible, but Alice had foreseen this and had already reached towards Kirito to protect him, getting his head out of the way from getting stuck in the ice as well. As Eugeo turned away before completely freezing Kirito, he responded to him one last time when he asked why he did it. "I'm sorry, Kirito. Alice, please don't come after me." Once he was back in Administrator's room, Eugeo was more conflicted than ever, but among all the emotions, one struck out to him harder than the others. He remembered seeing Alice with an eye patch, which caused him to make the connection quite easily. He once again felt inferior to his partner. It wasn't Eugeo who convinced Alice as he had feared just hours ago before reaching the floor 90's Great Bath. It was Kirito, but he had no right to complain at this point or feel jealous. After all, it was him who succumbed to the Pontifex and turned his blade to his friends. He was the one who betrayed the ones he cared about. Kirito, Alice, Tize, Roni and Frenica. their mentors Golgoroso and Sortilina, those who trusted him, Miss Azurica, Sadore the craftsman, everyone at the Valde farm from their time at Zakaria, Selka, Elder Gasfoot, and Old Man Garita from Rulit, and Cardinal who counted on him to save Underworld. But this is where we get the major changes territory all around. Once he snapped out of the thoughts, he felt like something was calling to him from the ceiling. He did look up to the beautiful mural. One of the crystals was calling to him. He tried to focus, but one voice grabbed back his attention. Eugeo heard the administrator chanting a sacred arts on her bed. It sounded graceful like a song, but Eugeo knew it was time to pay back the trust his friends had on him. After breaking out from Quinella's spell, he took off his armor only to hear Chudelkin's voice instead. Playing along with the Prime Senator's dialogue here, thinking Kirito would be much more imaginative with his intuition in this scenario, he managed to get close to Quinella without raising the suspicion of Chudelkin. I really love this detail right here in this scene when Quinella heals Eugeo, and many people can easily miss this due to not being into all these details as I am, but you can see that Quinella is not using any kind of traditional sacred arts as in, magic that requires spatial resources in this scene. She's directly using a system function to heal Eugeo here, hence why you see the system effects similar to what you see during Enhanced Armament. Really nice touch on the anime side that wasn't in the novels. But here you also get to hear why Eugeo's synthesis process was so quick. I was hinting towards this for the past couple of weeks, but unlike the regular synthesis ritual, where Quinella needed a lengthy process to isolate and remove memories to create space for the piety module, she had discovered a hole in Eugeo's memories. The memories that were deleted years ago, the moment Kirito was taken out of Underworld as a kid. It was Higa and Kikoka deleting Kirito from everyone's memories that had created this hole, hence why Quinella could even implement the piety module before Eugeo had woken up in her room. Isolation and removal of memories required a direct alteration of a floodlight, thus required the removal of core protection, but piety module was not sacred arts used on a floodlight. It was an item that is pushed into an empty location in someone's head, which explains how Eugeo had a nightmare featuring Quinella, why he felt more and more drained despite knowing what Quinella was doing, and of course the piety module visual during the episode 19 ending scene. And of course the piety module is an upgraded version that enhanced Eugeo's incarnation related abilities, but this is also the moment where we see why Quinella was not even alarmed by Eugeo in general back in episode 19. She did know Eugeo had a certain weapon, but she wasn't sure where he had been keeping it, but she didn't care enough about it to bother finding out as well. No matter what happened, she was safe against metal weaponry. But this shot after Eugeo is blown back is crucial. You can see various swords in the walls as quote-unquote decoration in this shot, as well as many others in some other shots too. So for now, these swords are the new statues of the Central Cathedral moment. They are very important for the future, but I won't be saying more on that. You have even seen some of these swords in the original version of the Resistor opening, and they do have a major role to play. If you want more information, my opening 3 explained video will provide you the spoilery answers, since my episode explained videos are non-spoilery. However, learning about what Quinella had done to Alice, Eugeo found just enough power to shine his sword in bright green again, the sign of the skill Sonic Leap. But not just the usual Sonic Leap. Kirito's advice was ringing in his ears. Sure, sword skills were system-assisted movement and you could let them do all the work, but Kirito had attempted to teach him that you can enhance the effects of a skill via additional physical movement. In the case of Sonic Leap, you could increase the range of the leap by a certain amount, an amount that would betray the expectations of the administrator standing way too far away for any regular sword skill to reach her, as far as she knew. Eugeo had tried the technique before time and time again, and face planting to the ground in the process, but this was the one time he was not allowed to fail. With the system assist coming into play, the moment Eugeo manually pushed himself forward with his legs with all the power he could muster up. And suddenly, the smile on Quinella's face vanished. Not just one like the anime shows, but multiple ice elements she tried to conjure burst before they could even take the shape of a needle as the Blue Rose Sword reached them at an incredible speed, and Eugeo smashed right against the protective seal once again. And that was the second instance the administrator showed visible signs of worry. But the entire scene played out differently than the anime actually. First off, Eugeo's plan was to cause the explosion on the seal again, and the moment it exploded, use the moment to stab Quinella with the dagger that he still held in his hand. But when he smashed against the barrier, there was no explosion this time around. Sure, he shouted a lot to break through the barrier, but shouting, or rather incarnation, was not the reason he made it past the barrier. In fact, Eugeo was just as surprised as Quinella when his Blue Rose Sword started not destroying the barrier, mind you, but slowly sliding through it. Quinella was the first to react to this unexpected development and instantly pushed herself back, taking the barrier with her and causing Eugeo's skill to whiff into the ground, leaving him in post-skill delay. Luckily for him, Quinella was too caught up in thoughts that the only sacred art she used was bursting wind elements to push him back, because with the time she actually had, as Eugeo was locked up in post-skill delay, she would have easily formed an arrow shape with the elements and cut off one or two limbs off of Eugeo instead of just pushing him back. But she needed that thought process and had figured out why the barrier had flute. That sword, now I see, she said. Eugeo wasn't sure if Quinella was referring to Cardinal's dagger or the Blue Rose Sword, as he had not yet understood the circumstances, but Quinella had just realized that the Blue Rose Sword was not a metallic object, and thus her barrier did not offer a flawless protection against the Blue Rose Sword. But just at that moment, Chudelkin came back running, and a neat little detail is that you can see him completely deflated as he had once again managed to run away from Alice and Kirito. But more importantly, the dialogue openly showcasing the distaste Quinella has towards Chudelkin has been entirely skipped. Her derogatory tone, mocking of his actions and looks, making it very clear that there was only one reason Quinella let Chudelkin be her right-hand man. It was the same reason both Eldri and Düsselbert had stopped chasing the rebels, the same reason Alice had denounced the Axiom Church, the same reason Eugeo had managed to come back to himself. But just seconds after, it was Kirito and Alice who came up to the room as well. It's really great that the anime used the very same grin on Kirito that they used for the child Kirito in earlier scenes, but I also find it funny that when Alice turns to look at Eugeo, she turns her right side where, well, she has no eye. In the novels, Eugeo was able to see Alice's other eye as well, not featuring the cold stare of an Integrity Knight, but the conflicted stare that of a human, and questions were in his head again, distracting him from his intention of telling Kirito about the protective barrier of Quinella. Did Alice know she was here to vanish? Did Kirito tell her about the full reality? And was Kirito even okay with the idea that Alice the Knight would have to vanish? But it's also kinda sad to see that all the playful banter between Kirito and Eugeo have been cut from this scene to save time, much like many others. Their childlike banter is always one of the highlights and what keeps Eugeo calm and collected in these moments, so I wish we had a little bit more than just the childlike grin. But a key detail in the scene, just before Alice denounces the Axiom Church, is when Quinella refers to Kirito as the quote-unquote irregular unit, showcasing that she is aware of the true nature of Kirito, the nature that she is full aware of, much like Cardinal. And remember when I was talking about the ceiling mural back in episode 19 and how a colorless void stood where Stacia, the goddess of creation, belonged? Well, this information should provide you the reason why. It's because Quinella is aware that the goddess of creation is not the pivotal figure of the legend of creation. It's the gods from the other side, and that colorless void symbolizes them, the other side. But this leads us to the contents of the next chapter as the perspective switches from Eugeo to Kirito, and we do get to hear more of how Quinella's aura that you saw earlier, or what you know as incarnation, is affecting the room. Even before rising into the room, Kirito had felt a sense of power and death, as it was a sign that even though he was safe from a possible synthesis ritual, Kirito knew that the administrator could inflict much worse things on him if she was able to. Kirito knew she wasn't though, thanks to Cardinal's extensive explanation that was cut from episode 13 however. Quinella was not bound by the taboo index that she herself created, but as a floodlight, unless she had ever broken the seal of the right eye, she was still bound by the basic ideological rules that she was raised with. Killing humans or even physically harming them was a breach of those rules, something she would not be able to do. But unknown to Kirito, Quinella had a multitude of plans to deal with them, the first of which was unleashing Chudelkin, who was most certainly born and raised in the Central Cathedral with none of those ideological rules, with the only rule he followed was the orders of the administrator. Half of the Integrity Knights were fighting all around the Empire and outside of the End Mountains, while the other half was either frozen or in the middle of their reset process, and Quinella had just grown very curious about Alice and subtly hinting at a bigger conspiracy in a very casual manner that you may easily miss in the heat of the moment and due to the subtitles being a bit off. Does that mean you independently removed the code 871 that was installed for me? Quinella did indeed have a contact in the real world, a contact close enough that he personally installed a system barrier on the floodlights behind the back of Wrath, maybe to actually help Quinella or maybe to buy time for something else, something much bigger than the goals of Quinella. But that was all Quinella knew regarding the seal and needed to inspect Alice to see what exactly happened, so it was time for Chudelkin, where an entire fight scene was cut off from the anime, but I'll keep it short as this video is really growing out to be a lengthy one at this point. Eugeo told Kirito about the deep freeze sacred arts, but he was cut off mid-sentence by Chudelkin when he was attempting to warn Kirito about the protective barrier of Quinella. The small man turned upside down, balancing himself on his head, and generated a total of 20 ice elements, and turning 10 he held in his hand into 5 icicles and launching them towards the group, forcing Alice to use her perfect weapon control to nullify them. Chudelkin then turned the other 10 formed on his toes into a giant block of ice to crush Alice completely, but Alice managed to destroy the giant cube after spending significant effort, mind you, with some pieces of the rubble damaging her in the process. And now it was time for Quinella to be displeased by her servant. She calmly lectured Chudelkin as to how Alice's Osmanthus blade had the highest authority level of all the divine objects, and that it was pathetic that he attempted to challenge that physical power with actual physical sacred arts. It was a very simple insult, but Chudelkin was thrilled by the idea that the administrator was giving him personal sacred arts lessons, and he went on to confess to her. He promised to vanquish the traitors, but he had one request: to spend the night with the Pontifex herself. Kirito was stunned by this confession, the bold request this clown was bringing to the administrator, the absolute ruler of the human empire, and he was certain that Alice and Eugeo were in the same state as well, but Kirito recognized the lies leaking from Quinella's lips. Chudelkin, of course, did not notice the lie here. The fact that Quinella had just swore on Stacia, the goddess of creation, was more than enough for him, but Kirito had already figured out that Quinella knew the three goddesses Stacia, Solus and Terraria were fake. Quinella did not believe in the power of the goddesses or Stacia, she knew about the other side, and thus the promise she had made was nothing more than empty words. But it did not matter for Chudelkin, as he went on to form 22 fire elements, 2 more than the ones he generated earlier, effectively burning his eyes in the process and transferring his control and vision over to the giant flaming clown instead. But that brings us to the end of episode 21, since this video has already been too long, if I'm judging correctly by the word count, so I hope you don't mind me cutting out the opinion bit short. And episode 22 is titled Sword Golem, so you probably do know what is up next. The rest of the episode should be full-blown fight scenes, so I can't tease you any more than I can right now, though do not be surprised if we happen to get an anime original scene from the Ocean Turtle. It's a small chance, but with this one episode we covered more than 1/3 of the book, and this pace would leave us with one extra episode unless future episodes are more detailed, so we will have to wait and see. But if you made it this far, do comment the swords on the walls to let me know. Ask your question in the comments if you have any to be featured in my weekly Alicization Q&A. Be mindful of the spoiler warnings though if your question is regarding the future. Thank you very much for watching, and a huge thanks to my patrons and YouTube members as usual. I'll see you soon with my Alicization Q&A, and until then, stay cool.